I lytter med til Radio Krishna. Matematikeren og filosofen William A. Dembski er forsker og universitetslektor i videnskabens begrebsmæssige grundlag ved Baylor University som seniorkollega ved Discovery Institutes Center for Science and Culture i Seattle. Han er også leder af International Society for Complexity, Information and Design. Dr. Dembski har tidligere undervist ved Northwestern University, University of Notre Dame samt University of Dallas. Han har gjort postdoktoralt arbejde i matematik ved MIT, i fysik ved The University of Chicago og i computervidenskab ved Princeton University. Han tog sin afsluttende eksamen ved University of Illinois i Chicago, hvor han modtog en Bachelor of Arts i psykologi, en MS i statistik og en Ph.D. i filosofi. Han modtog desuden en doktorgrad i matematik fra University of Chicago i 88, samt en cand.mag i teologi fra Princeton Theological Seminary i 1996. Han er beklædt student- og postdoktorale fellowship-stillinger ved National Science Foundation. Dr. Dembski har publiceret artikler om matematik, filosofi og teologijournaler, samt er forfatter af 7 bøger. I hans bog The Design Inference, Eliminating Chance Through Small Probabilities, udgivet på Cambridge University Press i 98, gennemgår han designargumentet i en postdarwinistisk sammenhæng og analyserer de forbindelser, der sammenkæder tilfældighed, sandsynlighed og intelligent årsag. Fortsættelsen på The Design Inference udkom på forlaget Rowman & Littlefield i 2002, hvor den darwinistiske model og andre naturalistiske evolutionsmodeller bliver kritiseret. Den bog har titlen No Free Lunch: Why Specified Complexity Cannot Be Purchased Without Intelligence. Dr. Dembski skriver for øjeblikket på en bog sammen med Michael Ruse for Cambridge University Press med titlen Debating Design From Darwin to DNA. Hans hjemmeside har adressen www.designinference.com. Og her i denne udsendelse af Radio Krishna skal vi høre et interview, vi lavede med William Dembski, da han var på besøg her i Danmark for nylig. Og det er Lalita Das, som står for interviewet, og Yadunandan Das, der styrer teknikken. Og her kommer det altså til at handle om intelligent design, hvilket, som I måske ved i korte træk, betyder, at man ikke kan forklare arternes fremkomst eller udvikling her på jorden, simpelthen med Darwins evolutionsteori, men at der må være intelligens bag.
Could you start with explaining a little about just yourself, your background, how you got involved with? You could, specialize in so many things.
Sure.
Why exactly like this?
Yeah. Well, my project over the last years has been to understand how we identify intelligence in natural systems. So we look at material objects, they exhibit certain patterns. Are there patterns that would reliably point us to intelligence? So how do we do that? Is that even possible to do that? And so I suggest that it is. I find that we do these sorts of design inference moves where we look for signs of intelligence in many artificial systems already. I mean, archaeologists will be looking at the ground and they'll say, oh, this is an arrowhead, but this is just a random chunk of rock. And so we draw these sorts of distinctions, but can we do this in some reliable way, and can we do it in ways then where we can apply it to biological systems in particular? And that's where my main interest is, to find design in biology, because the usual view among scientists is that intelligence is not something that's fundamental to the world. And intelligence is really an evolutionary byproduct. It's a survival strategy that's been given to us, but it's not something that informs the evolutionary process from the start. And so that makes it interesting and also controversial. Now, how I got into this, I was trained as a mathematician, and in the late 1980s, I was finishing my doctoral studies in mathematics, and I found at the time the study of randomness was very important and popular. There was this whole move in chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics, And so I was looking at the nature of randomness and what are the sorts of patterns that we look for that defeat randomness. And so that was really my entree into these questions. So it's looking at the patterns and classifying the sorts of patterns that we use to identify intelligence. And we do this in many areas. I mean, I give the example of archaeology, but there's also the whole search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Cryptographers look for patterns in cryptographic texts. And so, we do this in many areas. The question then is, can this be done in biology? And that's where it gets controversial.
Yeah. A little about your personal background. Are you from a religious background, or did you did the biology or like that convince you about there must be some kind of a...
I was, and remain to this day, a Christian when I started examining these questions, but these questions in randomness that really got me going were formulated as a straight project in mathematics and philosophy of mathematics, or I should say philosophy of science, philosophy of induction. So there was a straight research problem that motivated me. It was an interesting problem. It's one that I thought I could contribute to. I mean, I had an interest prior to this in evolution, and I was frankly skeptical of Darwinian evolution going into this, but I didn't really see a way to contribute one way or the other to this. I just had my personal doubts. But this project in the study of randomness and the patterns we use to defeat randomness one thing led to the next, and then got me in touch with some people who were critical of Darwinism and were writing about it. And so that's how I really got involved. So there's a whole research community that then emerged.
Yeah. Did you get in touch with Behe on an early stage, or?
Yeah, I met Michael Behe in, it was the spring of 1992 at a conference at Southern Methodist University in Texas, actually in Dallas. And he had been invited there. This was just at the time that Philip Johnson had written his book, Darwin on Trial. And there was a conference that was organized around that book. So Philip Johnson was the keynote speaker, and then there were 5 people, Darwinists, who were critiquing Johnson, and then 5 people who were supporting him. And Behe and I were supporting him, and so what they did was the supporters and the critics were matched up, and so we would each give a talk and then respond to each other. And Behe was there, and he was there because I think it was Nature or Science had written a very negative review of Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial, and Behe had written in and took exception to this review, thought that it was unfair and that criticism of Darwinism needed to be allowed and should be discussed in these forums. And that brought him to the attention of the organizers of this symposium. And so he was there, I was there. At the time, he hadn't developed his notion of irreducible complexity. That was about, I think, a year later. But from that time on, after that conference, we would meet periodically, at various conferences. And so I actually just saw him 3 weeks ago. So we see each other quite regularly.
Yeah. Could you describe a little about what is the present state of the intelligent design movement, or or kind of where are you at? And
yeah, I think we've made a lot of progress on a lot of different fronts. I think the scientific progress, that's where my main interest is. I think we are making it. It's steady, but it's slow. I think I would want to see faster progress. I think we've been very successful at raising questions about Darwinism and critiquing it, but getting a positive program where it goes beyond just the evidence points to design in these systems, but using that to gain some real biological insights, some novel insights, helping biologists to be better biologists. I think that's the real challenge at this point. And I believe that's coming. I think we have some work to do there. But even there, things proceed at different levels. There's work in theoretical foundations still in design detection, the nature of information, and I'm doing some work in that regard. And I've got some new research that I'm planning to write up soon. So I think the work moves forward. I think one thing to keep in mind also is that I think it is very few people who are having a disproportionate impact. I mean, intelligent design gets a lot of play in certainly the press in the United States. There are a lot of critics of it, but the people who are actually actively working and developing the program are very few. So you have many people who are supportive, but people who are doing, as it were, the heavy lifting are not that many. And so this is one of, I think, the real needs is to attract more talent. And not just, I think intelligent design has thus far been largely an American thing and even an evangelical Christian thing. I mean, that's where most of the talent has come from. Not exclusively. I mean, you have people like David Berlinski, who is a secular Jew. You have Jeffrey Schwartz, who's now becoming a major figure in this. He's a neuroscientist at UCLA, who is Jewish background and Buddhist in his orientation. So and this is why I'm happy to speak with you, because I found also much acceptance from the Hindu community, Krishnas. So I think there's a real need to broaden the boundaries and make it clear that this program is not a narrowly sectarian approach. This is really common property. I mean, the idea that there's intelligence or purpose behind the world is really something fundamental to most religious faiths, and it's really only this materialistic, atheistic conception of the world that has become so dominant in the West that that intelligent design is now threatening, and as a result, the materialistic and academic elite are resisting that. But I do want to see a lot more talent being drawn to this movement from a lot of different sources, and that's happening. And then I think in the United States, at least, I mean, in the American context, intelligent design is making great strides at the level of public policy, influencing school boards and public consciousness. Empowering people, making them confident that that they can challenge evolutionary theory and do so effectively. I think often that the sense has been that our intuitions tell us that there's design, but then the Darwinists, they have worked through all the theoretical implications, and in science, it often happens that our intuitions are not in sync with the reality. And so intelligent design is saying, no, there are good theoretical reasons to hold to design and to think that Darwinism does not, in fact, hold up. And so I think that's one of its strengths, is giving people the tools, conceptual tools, to think through these issues and then draw the appropriate design conclusion. So it is saying our intuitions are, in fact, leading us right and not astray, as the Darwinists would tell us.
You talk about the impact in America. I read in New York Times in the beginning of this year said that it was 28% Americans believe in evolution, which implies that 72% do not. Is that? I mean, that seems like it's quite much, on a rise. Is that can that be attributed to the intelligent design to a large degree, or? No,
I'd like to take credit, but I think it would be interesting also to see what was really behind that question. What did people think they were affirming or negating? Because I've seen various polls, for instance, conducted by Gallup, which is a major pollster in the United States, over the last 20 years, and when it's put in terms of did God have anything to do with the evolutionary process, or why we're here? Usually only about 10% reject any role for some sort of divine influence or intelligent guidance to our reason for being here. And then when you ask those who actually believe in some sort of divine guidance, it usually breaks up about 50-50, or maybe actually a little bit of a preponderance for people who believe in special creation, humans being actually pretty recently created, and then theistic evolutionists of some sort, where there is an evolutionary process, but God is guiding it. And so actually the numbers are in some sense even more extreme than what you just cited, because you have then only 10% who hold to this strict materialistic account of evolution, and then the rest either hold to some form of special creation or some sort of guided evolution. And a guided evolution is compatible with intelligent design. I mean, so is a special creation. But so it's an interesting reversal. I don't know how it is here in Europe, where I think the forces of secularization have been I think much more effective. But in the United States, you have the great majority of the population holds or finds intelligent design congenial. I mean, when I say they find it congenial, I mean they may not explicitly refer to it as intelligent design, but they think that there's some sort of design or intention behind the world. But when you go to the academy, and especially the highest levels of this in the sciences, you find that those numbers are exactly reversed. So you go to the National Academy of Sciences, which is the highest body of scientists in the United States. All the Nobel laureates in the sciences will be there. Very best scientists in the United States are members of the NAS, the National Academy of Sciences. And only about 7% are theists. The rest are atheists. So you see that the numbers are very much reversed, whereas in the general population it is about 90% or more that believe in God. Mm-hmm. And why is there this disconnect? I mean, that's an interesting sociological question. I think fundamentalism, young Earth creationism, just traditional Christian belief has been very effective in the United States in a way that it hasn't been in Europe. I think there's much more of a tradition of independent, free thinking there. There's no state church, and so people are able to form communities and really isolate themselves. And I think many of the Christians have felt beleaguered by this secularism and modernism, and so they've put themselves into these isolated communities, which has had positive and negative impact. On the one hand, I think it has protected them from this materialistic view. I mean, I feel much closer to the young Earth creationists than I do to the hardcore Darwinists. I mean, they like intelligent design by and large. We differ, on details of the creation, but and I mean, some would say, well, we also differ about a lot of science. We do, but there's a commonality in holding to a design and purpose behind the world, and even a common Christian faith. Whereas with the Darwinist, I mean, there's this reductionistic, materialistic worldview, which I think anybody with any sense of spiritual longings or belief in a higher, power, purposiveness, that includes just most religious traditions, finds that uncongenial. So I do feel, that's why I'm careful not to alienate the young Earth creationists. It's not that I agree with them right down the line, but I find that many of them are really quite intelligent. They're able to do good work on this question of design. And the design question holds. I mean, it's a question that confronts us regardless of our views of geology or the age of the Earth. I mean, 5,000 or 6,000 years, 6 billion years for the age of the Earth. It's that doesn't matter. I mean, the design problem, evolving the sorts of systems that the Darwinists say have evolved by these material means, it won't happen in 6 billion years. It won't happen in 6 trillion years. It won't happen in 6 to the 6 million years. I mean, it's the improbabilities are so stacked against it.
Yeah. Actually, why is even the question important? I mean, for a common man walking on the street, he'd say this is kind of a very lofty discussion, in the ivory towers of the academics. But I mean, why does it have any relevance to the common man? Whether we're
Well, I think it does. I mean, I was reading in an American periodical a few years ago. There was a common misconception about the workers in France after World War II and why they turned to communism. And the common thought was, well, they had been exploited by the bourgeoisie. This was their way. Why did they embrace it? And one of the top reasons, apparently, for why they rejected religion and turned to communism was that they thought the Genesis had been disproven. Mm-hmm. And I think, why is it? I mean, parents are frankly concerned about their children being exposed to evolutionary theory and then losing their faith. I mean, it's most people who have religious convictions, strong religious convictions, do so because they think those convictions are true, that they're beneficial, and it's something they want to pass on as a heritage to their children. You know, and they see it as a blessing, something that they can confer. And Darwinian evolution, its teaching, I would go so far as to say its indoctrination, has been very successful at driving out faith of some of the brightest of young intellects. And it works, I think it works effectively because it's not that Darwinian evolution proves that there is no God, but I think it makes it makes God or any sort of divine purposiveness seem irrelevant. You know, if you can explain all the wonders of nature, and especially biological nature, apart from any design or purposiveness as the result of random forces, you know, what need is there to, you know, I mean, if you can explain that, can't you explain everything else? And you're seeing this sort of reductionism flowing out of evolutionary theory. We've now evolutionary psychology, evolutionary ethics. I mean, evolutionary explanations of religion. You know, how evolution has programmed us to be religious creatures because it helps with group survival, and you know, I mean, there are all sorts of arguments that are made. You know, and so it's I think evolution is used to argue for the superfluity of religion, that it's not necessary. And for many scientists, I mean, if a young person is captivated with science, you know, as a graduate student, spends 12 hours a day in the lab, and sees no relevance of religious belief to anything that he or she is doing there, I think it becomes a gnawing sense that this religion is irrelevant, it holds nothing, and atheism comes to seem plausible. You know, and I think that's the progression for people. So it's not that, you know, people are argued or badgered into unbelief. It's just belief seems irrelevant. You know, and I think that's the way it tends to go.
And all ethics and like that's actually undermined in society.
I think so. You know, it's I'm reading a book by the skeptic called Michael Shermer. He's actually, I regard him as a friend. We debate sometimes. And it's called The Science of Good and Evil. And the interesting thing, though, is there's very little science in there. I mean, it's all based on a presupposition of evolution and evolutionary psychology. And much of this discussion is about God and God's irrelevance, and trying to explain away the goodness of people like Mother Teresa, showing that, in fact, they are acting out of self-interest and not out of any sort of real altruism. You know, because evolution is ultimately a very competitive sort of process, and you know, Darwin called it the great battle of life. Current contemporary evolutionists try to put a softer face on it sometimes, but it's you know, it's hard to square any sort of real goodness, real you know, selfless actions on behalf of others on an evolutionary framework. I mean, it's you know, so I was in fact talking to somebody yesterday at Aarhus, where, you know, it's the problem of good that's the problem for the evolutionists, and they have to explain it away. You know, and I think that's, you know, that's very unfortunate. I mean, it leads to, I think, a very cynical view of life. You know, and I think. And so why is this important to people? Because I think what it does is you have materialistic view which has been suffocating people, suffocating their spiritual longings, and intelligent design promises to open the windows and, you know, air out, get rid of all this musty stuffiness, and give people some fresh air to breathe.
Yeah. Like the great majority of scientists, they kind of against the idea, at least presently, about intelligent design, has been so for at least since the time of Darwin, 150 years like that. So actually what you're saying is that there's something radically wrong with the whole conception that science has been having for more than 1 century. Yeah. It's a little incredible for many people to, you know, we have all these highly educated people, yeah. Have they really been wholesale off?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe simplifying a little bit too much. I mean, people in Darwin's day didn't cash in their Christianity right away. I mean, they did. Darwin was extremely successful very quickly. I mean, he was buried in Westminster Cathedral. So he certainly was a figure of great credibility there. Darwin had a correspondent in America named Asa Gray, who was a botanist at Harvard University, who accepted Darwinism but thought that this was God's means of creation. So I think many scientists made their peace with Darwinism and their religious belief. And I think to this day there are still many high-powered scientists who are also theists or religious believers. I mainly know the Christian world in the United States, but you have Francis Collins, who's the head of the Human Genome Project, the National Human Genome Project. He is a Christian believer. There's one Nobel laureate who comes to mind. Many of them, however, are theistic evolutionists in the sense that they accept the Darwinian account of evolution and then think that this is God's method of creating. So there's a weird kind of disconnection there. I mean, you have this method of creating, this Darwinian method, which gives no evidence of design. Francisco Ayala, a Darwinist, will say that Darwin's greatest achievement was to show how you could evolve all these great systems without any recourse to a designer. So it's a method of creation that does not need a creator, and yet it was created. So I think it's kind of a strange position to hold, but I think it's held by many scientists who are Christians because they see this as the best science available, and they want to hold to their Christian belief. And so it's the marriage that they have taken part in to hold these two disparate views together. I think it's highly problematic, but that's the way it is. So, but to come back to your point about can all these scientists be wrong? Can a million Frenchmen be wrong? Yes, people can be massively wrong, and many of them, and the sheer numbers that are wrong doesn't mean that that they're not wrong. I mean, it's majority rule doesn't decide on the truth of a proposition. I think there are reasons why that we have come to the state we're in. I think a reductionist approach to science has been very successful in physics and chemistry, and even at various levels in biology. But I don't think it has worked well. I think the Darwinists had their opportunity to prove their theory, to establish it in ways that would have been convincing. I think they've failed, and I think now with our increasing knowledge of biochemistry and molecular biology and what is going on in the cell, their theory is becoming increasingly implausible, and even attempts to flesh it out and to supplement it. There are various approaches to try to shore up Darwinian theory. I mean, there's something called evo-devo, evolutionary developmental biology. There's a neutral theory of evolution which supplements it. There's a symbiogenesis theory of Lynn Margulis. But all these approaches are basically additions to the Darwinian theory, but still, I think, ineffective in explaining these vast increases in biological complexity that need to be explained if evolution happened, the way they claim. So, I think yes. Scientists have been misled, mistaken. I think what is I think the roots of this were laid really very early with the rise of modern science. I think you had a mechanistic conception of science that came in.
Back to even Newton and Descartes.
Newton, Descartes, Francis Bacon. Rejection of Aristotelian metaphysics and not just metaphysics but physics. Because Aristotle really, for him, his four causes, material, efficient, final, and formal causes, these were all of one cloth. This is what you needed to understand the phenomenon. And there was a conscious separation made, that you must eliminate teleology. This is not a way to understand nature. You want to understand in terms of material and efficient causes. And I think that, and it wasn't just this as a regulative principle for science, but there was also conception of science as I mean, Descartes, I mean, there's a very mechanical view. I mean, nature worked by things interacting with other things by contact. And with Newton, that was relaxed a bit, but it was a world fundamentally of particles interacting by forces, and so how do you get information? How do you get logos, intelligence into that? Well, you can get it by arranging things in meaningful arrangements, but that meaning is not inherent. It's something that has to be super added. And the problem then is that matter is already in motion. Matter is already able to arrange itself. So why can't it just do all its own arranging, its own self-organizing? And so there was a logic, I think, that just pushed you. And one way I sometimes illustrate that is, you think about the design arguments, and Newton was all for design, but you think about the design argument, the last great push in natural theology and design arguments was in the 1800s. So it was 1802, 1803, William Paley published his Natural Theology. And the image there is of a clockwork universe. And I mean, the design is a clock. If you find a watch in a field, you'll know it's design. And then that's the basis of an analogy for design in biology. But you think about a watch, okay? What's the best watch you could imagine? Well, the best watch would be one that would never need winding, right? I mean, keep perfect time. But wouldn't it be better also if it assembled itself? I mean, watches are made by other material objects and processes. So what about a watch that makes itself? Wouldn't that be even better? So a designer of a watch would be a better designer if he made a perfect watch, a watch that never needs winding, and a watch that constructs itself. But suddenly, you have not a god or a designer that is responsible for contrivances, but rather a designer that's responsible for a world that can do its own contriving. So any sort of deity or designer gets pushed back into the laws. You see a very natural move to deism. And then suddenly, though, you have a world that's doing its own construction. Why do you need a designer at all? You just have a world that has the capacities to do its own designing, its own construction. And I think that was where the science pushed us. I think and I think these seeds were planted right at the start of modern science. And so and I think it's no accident that the key conception of science is one of force, things imposing, moving other things. And what you don't have is really information, logos, word, things being informed by meaning, by purposes. And I mean, you think about it, I mean, in our own, as human beings, we think thoughts, we speak words, which concretize our thoughts, but then they need to be put into action. And when the action is where force comes in, and that's what physics has dealt with, but it's not focused on that logos that is prior to, the action. And I think what intelligent design is doing is now merging, this logos or information with the force. I mean, you just think about it. I mean, I think there's some very rich metaphors here. I mean, here we are, we're speaking. There is compression waves that are traveling between us, but they're also being informed by information. And really, you can't understand what is transpiring between us entirely in terms of one or the other. I mean, if you just analyze compression waves, what is that telling you? Okay, but there's that which is a carrier for some information, and both are together, and they're entirely integrated. And I think this is where I'm hoping that intelligent design will make for a much richer theory of science. Not richer, I mean, you can't speak of a theory of science, but a richer framework for science in which we can have richer theories for understanding the world and gain insights into the world that we couldn't on simply a materialistic basis. And I think that, to me, this is very exciting. I mean, because it's not that we're losing anything. We're not denying that material processes operate in the world. They do. Darwinism. If Darwinism could explain all the wonders that we see in creation, if it could really do the job, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. I mean, the Darwinists would have triumphed and their theory would be vindicated. But that's not the case. The theory is in great trouble. And that's why we're having this discussion, and that's why these possibilities are now being broached.
What is your strategy for your work? I mean, you must be doing a lot of research, and also you're traveling and making speeching.
Well, I think I tend to be an opportunist as a scholar, so I go where the interesting problems are, and sometimes it's a matter of also putting out fires. I mean, you have critics or people who are, because this is a very controversial debate. I mean, there's a lot that depends on it, and it works at various levels. I mean, there's a scientific front, there's a public policy and cultural front. Some will talk about culture wars, Kulturkampf. And so I think there is that, and so I tend to work at all these levels. I mean, I've given testimony at textbook hearings. There are in fact, all the textbooks in the United States that teach evolutionary theory all the mainstream textbooks, I guess I should say, adopt a Darwinian point of view. I mean, in fact, that's all they present. I mean, the thing is, it's not just Darwinism or design. There are criticism of Darwinism among non-design biologists, but even those are not treated. There's just this, what students are presented with is a consensus as though this has been well established. And then there are evidences used to quote unquote prove evolutionary theory, and many of these evidences are bogus. I mean, they mischaracterize the evidence, or they're outright frauds. I mean, and I saw this in the Texas textbook hearings. You had textbooks that show give representations of embryos that are supposed to be very similar at early stages of development and then diverge. Haeckel's embryo diagrams. The thing is, these are thoroughly. It's been known. I mean, it was known in Haeckel's time that they were faked. I mean, because basically what it did is he just recopied the same embryo. I mean, and the idea there is that if evolutionary theory is true, then organisms, multicelled organisms, develop from embryos to an adult stage. And if evolutionary theory is true, then at earlier stages in the embryo, they should be close. If they are in fact evolutionarily related, they should look more similar, and then they should diverge. I mean, the idea is sort of an arrow shot at a target. The more sooner in its trajectory that you divert it from the target, the further off it will go. So organisms should, if they have a recent common ancestor, they should look similar longer into their embryological development than those that have been separated longer. Okay, so that's the rationale. I mean, it makes sense, but the fact is it's not confirmed. You have, in fact, one remarkable finding in embryology is that you'll find organisms that the adult stage, it looks identical, and they've gotten there by very different developmental trajectories, But anyway, I mean, with coming back to Haeckel, I mean, he faked them. I mean, in fact, he didn't even look at the earliest stages in embryo development, but then he just basically repeated the same drawing over and over. So, and these drawings are still in the biology textbooks. And the interesting thing is when this is challenged, the evolutionists in the United States, they will, the proper response would be to say, we're sorry that we've misled our young people this way. We'll fix it. We'll correct this. We'll get rid of these drawings. But they don't do that. What they say rather is that these drawings at least convey the right idea, and that that these design people are really misrepresenting the evidence. And so, in fact, we, as the bearers of this bad news, are the ones who are attacked. So the tables get turned. So it's really quite remarkable. But so I deal with that. I deal with trying to developing my own research program, which is very much still on this level of design detection, the nature of information, and the limits to the generation of this type of information that I use to identify the effects of intelligence. So I've my fingers in many different pies, and I keep very busy.
Yeah. You travel all over the world?
I do. I mean, I try to limit just how much I get away because it's difficult on my family. But I've been all over the place. I mean, most of my travel is within the United States, but I've I've been to the Far East. If I get to England, it seems quite a bit, and Europe less so.
It seems to me like your life as a scholar researcher is not like a peaceful life. I mean, it's exciting, but it's very much like being in the front like in a war with there's a shooting forth and back, and there's ridicule and resistance and.
Yeah, I mean, all of that is there. If you've got it, and it's you just keep. I think one of the things that helps me in this regard is, I've dealt with the hardcore materialists and Darwinists so long now that I realize that there's little point in trying to convince them. I mean, often you think, hey, I've got a good argument, I'm pretty smart, I've thought these things through, if they could just listen to me and get it clear, they'll see the light, and that's not going to happen. Okay, so whenever I'm really talking to these people, I'm not so much talking to them as I'm talking to the people who are listening in on the conversation. And so the challenge for me is to keep my cool, my composure, address their legitimate concerns insofar as they have them, and keep hammering away the main points. And what are the main points? That intelligence is fundamental, that these materialistic mechanisms are inadequate for explaining the types of complexity that we have in biology, and hold out the promise of some real biological insights that we couldn't have, and that on a materialistic hypothesis, and that materialism is a constricting ideology, that it's not a path to true inquiry. So these are the sorts of things that I will try to stress, and it seems to be effective. I mean, in part, I think it is because the materialists, I mean, they are the ones who hold the power and the money, and so they have a much greater stake in this. I mean, there are all sorts of institutional and professional incentives that they have, which we don't. I mean, I think you as Hare Krishnas must experience this also. I mean, you're subject, you have nothing to lose. So there's a certain freedom that comes with this that the other side cannot afford to have. So I can take criticisms, I can modify and even accept legitimate criticisms that come. On the other hand, they operate out of what I have in fact called in some of my work a zero concession policy. That I cannot afford to concede anything. We have to be entirely wrong. We have to be pseudoscientists. We do not have a scientific program as far as they're concerned. Because once they admit that, there's a slippery slope. I mean, they no longer have a monopoly, and they need a monopoly, to carry out their program, because it is, as I stated in my lecture just a little while earlier, for hardcore Darwinists like Richard Dawkins, he will write, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Every aspect of biology, insofar as there's design there, it is merely an appearance of design. There's no actual design, no intelligence, no place where a designer or creator is needed. Okay, there's no place. So it is enough for me to show, hey, well, here's an instance of design. Here's an instance. And so they can't allow that, and so they have to reject. There's a vast front that they have to protect if we're going to use a warfare metaphor. And as a result, I mean, what they need to resort to is ad hominem arguments. They need to delegitimize us at every point. And for many, that's how it operates. It's actually quite amusing. I mean, because I will, in some ways, because I will sometimes be in conversation. I mean, the funny thing is, I mean, some of these people, I mean, they actually seek me out, and they want, in some sense, they want some approval or recognition from me. So there's this one fellow who's quite amazing. I mean, he will, my books get endorsed by some pretty prominent people, and he will actually write to the endorsers of my books and harass them for having endorsed my book. So there's an engineer in Australia, and this fellow contacted him and said, because he's from Canada, he says, there are codes of ethics that engineers in Canada have to subscribe to. And do you realize that endorsing Dembski's book the way you have, you're violating these codes of ethics, And so, nothing I do can be right in his public pronouncements, but then he gets in touch with me and tells me that, you know, when he was reviewing my book No Free Lunch, he was 3 times a week, long conversation with this other guy he was collaborating with. So they take these things very seriously, but then in terms of the public presentation, we're totally, you know, out to lunch. I have a book, No Free Lunch, and there's the expression "out to lunch," which is that it's completely ridiculous. You know, and now there's even a level of the criticism is not just that it's ridiculous, but that it's actually pernicious, that it's dangerous what we're doing. And so there was a recent article, Marshall Berman in the American Biology Teacher, where it was intelligent design, threat to society, not just science. So now we're a threat to society.
Undermines the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Something like that.
These people want to shut this down. And the thing is, I think it really plays into our hands because, I mean, what they're doing, I mean, there's very much sense of censorship and shutting down discussion. And I think young people, they're sensitive to this. They know that, you know, this is not going to work. It was funny, I was speaking at the University of Washington about 3-4 years ago, and the biologists were informed that I was going to be speaking on campus, and so they actually sent out an email to a lot of other places saying, you know, we did not sponsor this, and, you know, do not come to this, and, you know, as a result, I mean, they couldn't have given me better publicity.
Free advertisement.
Yeah.
And that also means, because as far as I know, they're like 3 levels, or, you know, like for example, when there's a controversial theory, first thing is just completely neglect, because any attention, even negative, that means you kind of acknowledge it. But when it becomes too big, then you have to attack and ridicule. So it seems like intelligent design is now at a level where actually they cannot stop it just by pretending it's not there.
Ignoring it. Right. I think. I mean, it's an interesting switch that has happened also, because I think we. In the past, we actually got more respectful treatment, you know, by people, and now I think I think there still is that. I mean, and you know, you can't paint with too broad a brush, but I think there is much more now this sense that this needs to be shut down, and you know, this is where also I think the whole, you know, there's a scientific program and there's a cultural program, and I think where they reinforce each other, because intelligent design has now so much popularity at the cultural level, and people are concerned about, you know, what is being taught in the schools. Is it legitimate just to teach Darwinian evolutionary theory? Should weaknesses and criticisms be taught, which is separate from teaching intelligent design? I mean, you know, there are weaknesses of evolutionary theory that you could just treat on its own terms, you know. And so these questions arise, and because of that, the Darwinists feel that they need to weigh in on this and attack intelligent design on the scientific front. So I think, you know, I'm just coming back to your point about why they are now dignifying us with their attention instead of ignoring us. You know, and it is because I think they see too much riding on this, that because intelligent design has made this cultural progress. You know, I think many of them just think, well, there's no scientific merit here at all. Many of them haven't read anything, I would say, on this. I mean, there's a review of my book, No Free Lunch, in Nature, and a fellow named Brian Charlesworth reviewed it, and I had no sense that he had read any of it. I mean, it was just general platitudes about design being disproven, and I had no sense that he had read it. I mean, you know, there are critics, I mean, who have engaged it. I mean, been very critical, but who've actually read it. But in his case, he hadn't even done that. So I think there's a knee-jerk reaction. This just needs to be shut down. One of the highest bodies of scientists, I mean, this is a professional organization called the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. They've issued now a formal denunciation of intelligent design. And interesting thing is, when one of my colleagues approached I think it was the chairman of this committee, it was a committee of about 10 people or so that issued this statement on behalf of the AAAS. He gave no evidence of having read any of the materials. You know, he was going by what other people told him. You know. So, but again, I think this is all very useful. I mean, all this publicity plays into our hands because it raises consciousness, and the people who are so vehemently critical, I don't think are going to be convinced anyway. You know, so I think my hope is really with a newer generation that's going to look at these ideas dispassionately. And I'm not saying anything else anything that Darwin didn't say. I mean, he didn't see his theory as prospering at the hands of the old guard. He saw it as a new generation. And I think this is the way science tends to work. Max Planck remarked that a new scientific theory prospers essentially on the graves of the old scientists.
Kuhn says, what is Kuhn? What he's...
Well, Thomas Kuhn, he quotes Max Planck, and that's where I actually got that quote. You know, so it's in Planck's autobiography. But you know, I think that's often how it goes. I mean, people who've been trained in a given worldview, it's just difficult to break out. And and I think especially now with the way science has gone, I mean, there's so many institutional incentives. I mean, if you say that you are in favor of intelligent design, and if you're a biologist, if word gets around, I mean, how are you going to get research funding from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health? And if you don't have that funding, your status at your job is going to, most of these people are professors or on faculty at some university. How are they going to, maintain themselves, maintain their prestige? It's better either to ignore this entirely or to come out against intelligent design. There's no incentive to promote intelligent design at this point. Now, my hope is that this will change when intelligent design gets to the point where it is generating interesting research problems that people are solving and they're making a name for themselves. I think when that happens, Darwinism is finished. I think, but I'm not sure of how far off that is yet. I would hope that's going to be soon, but I think that's the big barrier. But I think when that happens, look for the Berlin Wall to crumble. It's going to be very quick. Yeah.
Is there because I kind of know like three frontiers against Darwin. One is this critique of complexities which Darwinism cannot account for. Another is we spoke about Michael Kramer and Richard Thompson's, and this where they are criticizing the whole fossils and all the fraud that is going on there. And the third field is the field of paranormal phenomena and the whole, like for example, Ian Stevenson and Sabum and near death. I mean, all this whole. Is a kind of an alliance between these three separate fields. They're all attacking the same thing, from have different approaches. Yeah,
well, interesting. Certainly there are critiques of Darwinism, by people in my camp on the basis of the fossil record. I'm not sure if they go as far as Michael Cremo goes, but I think a big place where some of my colleagues are focusing their energies is on the Cambrian explosion, this great proliferation of really all the extant animals trace their lineage back to these basic body plans that came about in the Cambrian. All these basic animal forms, what are called phyla, originate there. So there is that. Argument from biological complexity. Now, paranormal, that's an interesting point. I think some of my colleagues have been frankly reluctant to make common cause with people who work on paranormal phenomena just because I think their sense is that we have so many troubles and people were fighting already. Why invite that, because
of the reputation.
Yeah, I think in their view, the people who work on paranormal phenomena are even regarded as more disreputable than we are, But I've actually been open to it. I don't know if you know the name Dean Radin, but he wrote The Conscious Universe, and his done a lot of statistical analyses of experiments on paranormal phenomena, and has argued, I think, quite persuasively for that there's something going on there. So I'm open to that, you know. And I don't think it's just those three areas, though. I think neuroscience is going to be an area where, because I've got some colleagues, Mario Beauregard at the University of Montreal and Jeffrey Schwartz at UCLA, where, I mean, they're doing studies in which mind is affecting the brain in ways that you cannot account for in reductionist terms. I mean, because the usual approach is reductionist, that consciousness, free will, that these are really illusions. I mean, that they're sort of byproducts of brain processes, but of nothing that has any reality, intrinsic reality. So, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, just how many fronts develop, in this whole debate. And I think, when you talk about fronts, I mean, there are fronts within fronts. I mean, intelligent design is not just, I would say, it's not just this argument from complexity. You have people there who are making, I think, some of the most trenchant critiques of evolutionary theory just as it is. My friend and colleague Jonathan Wells wrote a book, Icons of Evolution. I mean, this is where he's critiquing the textbooks, and I think it's a very powerful case just against evolution, evolutionary theory as it's now presented, regardless of what the alternatives might be. And I found comment by David Berlinski, who's one of our number, very useful. He will talk about, he'll say the alternative to intelligent design doesn't have to be Darwinism. It can be intelligent uncertainty. I mean, this could be an option, that we just suspend judgment and say, look, regardless of what the truth of the matter might be, Darwinism is a failed theory. It does not deserve our credence. I mean, often the Darwinists will say, well, you're just offering an argument from incredulity. You're unwilling to believe that these Darwinian processes could accomplish all this amazing design work. But we turn the question around. I mean, they're offering an argument from credulity. I mean, it seems that they're willing to believe just about anything. And so there's that. I think some very interesting work that has come out recently is by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. They've just written a book called The Privileged Planet. And there's been a number of books now. I mean, there's a whole enterprise of SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, where they're arguing that life on other planets is likely, and that it's likely that we're going to see evidence of that. Now, more recently, there have been some indications against that life on planet Earth may well be unique, or at least intelligent life. And so there's a book by Warden Brownlee titled Rare Earth. Simon Conway Morris, in his recent book Life Solution, will argue for life being, or at least intelligent life being, rare. And then this book, The Privileged Planet, makes that case, but then even goes further and says that our place in the universe is not just designed for habitability, or being life permitting and fostering intelligent life, but also fosters scientific discovery, is making, that we're not just in some insignificant part of the universe, but we're in an ideal position in the universe and in our planetary system to make scientific discoveries. It's important that the moon just occlude the sun as it does with eclipses, because that gives us certain scientific insights. It's important that we are where we are in the Milky Way, because that allows us to observe stars, get a good view of the universe, which we wouldn't if we were in other places. They're making an argument for design, which is really quite different from the sort that I make. But it's I think finding signs of intelligence on still another level, and I think that's what in a sense that's what I see the people who are studying paranormal phenomena are doing. I mean, I see them as really seeing information transmission that does not follow some materialistic channel. That's how I interpret most of that work, and so I think it all fits together. I would like to see more collaboration. I think that may be happening. I'm actually planning a very large volume of edited papers with Jeffrey Schwartz and Mario Beauregard, these two neuroscientists that I mentioned, which we're tentatively titling The End of Materialism, and we'll have many different sections, and one will be on paranormal phenomena, or we'll include that, although I think we'll title it Inconvenient Facts. So that will be just one section. I mean, there'll be biology, physics, cosmology, neuroscience, religious experience. All of these will be featured as sections, with essays.
You say kind of it's not necessary. I mean, it's not that the theory of intelligent design or like Darwinian evolution is not like the only two possibilities, but actually isn't, when you get down to it, either if the material explanation fails, then everything that's left is some kind of intelligence. Is there actually a third?
No, I think you've made a good point, and I actually argue this in one of my books. I mean, I think it is true that in the textbooks in the United States, the only thing you get is really neo-Darwinism, but I would say that's a specific form of Darwinism. I mean, it's you've got basically three things that are going on with any materialistic theory of evolution. You've got to have some sort of heritability, replication. Organisms are on the scene, they're replicating, they're giving rise to new organisms, which are largely like them. But there also has to be some variation, because otherwise you just are going to be making identical copies and there cannot be any evolution. So there has to be some variation, and there has to be sifting of that variation, and that's natural selection. Sifting of variation, those that are better at reproducing and surviving get to survive and reproduce than those that don't. But it's that question of variation. I think that's where most of the concern is. And neo-Darwinism says that it's really random genetic changes that's driving the whole thing. But it could be other changes. It could be organisms combining, hybridizing, it's distinct organisms. That's Lynn Margulis's view. It could be genes transferring wholesale, lateral gene transfer. That's supposed to happen at least on
the bacterial level.
At the bacterial level. Could happen at higher levels. So there are many ways of trying to cash it out, but everything ultimately has to be funneled through natural selection. That's the great designer substitute. And so I would say, at some level, it is Darwinism. I mean, it's. I know that some of the evolutionary biologists, they'll say, well, you're just oversimplifying. You're making Darwinism your target, but that's a straw man. But really, evolutionary theory is much richer. But usually, what they have in mind is that there are these supplements to the theory. There's now quite popular is what's called evo-devo. You look evolutionary developmental biology, where you're looking at various genes that control development, that act as switches, and that if they switch on or off at inappropriate times, you can get some pretty large changes in the adult organism. But in all cases that I know, these switches, when you have these major changes, they're not viable, or they don't help the organism to reproduce. There's no fundamentally new structure that gets introduced, and also, I mean, you have a problem really in explaining evolutionary novelty and diversity, because you have the same sort of genes in a lot of different organisms, but they're controlling different things. So if you have the same gene controlling different things, different types of eyes. I mean, an eye of an insect is very different from a mammalian eye. Let's say you have the same gene that's controlling, development of that, but you've got these vastly different eyes. How have you explained, in terms of the identical gene, development of these different eyes? I mean, you haven't. You've got. I mean, it's you haven't explained it. If you've got a difference, the way you count for a difference is in terms of an antecedent difference, but you have the same thing. How are you explaining that difference? Well, you haven't. So my point is just, you have these things, these supplements to Darwinian theory, But at some level, I think all these materialistic theories of evolution look to natural selection as a designer substitute, and then they need some variation, some source of variation as the creative potential on which this natural selection can operate. So at some level, I think any materialistic theory of evolution is a Darwinian theory. And so what is the alternative? I think some form of intelligent design, where you have some real teleology that's making a difference and that you can detect. And so, yes, I think this is the fundamental divide. But, you know, if I'm going to try to dislodge evolutionary theory in the textbooks, it's sometimes more effective for me not to come at it from the point of view of intelligent design, but say, okay, here you've got neo-Darwinism that's being presented in the textbooks. Let's invoke Lynn Margulis or Stephen Jay Gould and let them cancel each other out. Let them fight it out because they're disagreeing. You know, I think they are agreed on the broad materialistic program, but you know, here they're disagreeing, and the thing is that disagreement is not making it into the textbooks. Why not? You'd have to admit that that's a scientific disagreement, regardless what you think about intelligent design, because most of the opponents want to say it's not even science. Well, what Stephen Jay Gould was doing, or Lynn Margulis, you know, are they doing science? Well, clearly yes, they would want to say that, but. You know, so why are they not even presenting a controversy within the materialistic sphere? And
because they intuitively know that actually, if you kind of debunk Darwinism, there is actually only intelligent design.
I think that's right, yeah. And you know, I think they don't want, you know, it's if they can convince the public that there is no real controversy regarding, scientists are united on this, I think that they feel that they're in a stronger position to resist intelligent design. So that's why they don't want to give any public perception of internal controversy. Yeah.
I'm thinking about a fourth kind of argument, and involved that kind of a cultural and language argument that cultures, they also, I mean, they're very complex. Do they just arise from simple and become complex? Or languages, as far as I know, it's quite known that languages, they don't become more structured and complex, but actually become more irregular and more simplified with time.
Yeah, I've thought about that myself. I mean, I haven't developed this though, and you know, it would be an interesting project for a linguist. I mean, because I remember studying ancient Greek, you know, and as the language developed, and Homeric Greek was more complex than Attic Greek, which was more complex than Koine Greek, you know, the Greek of the New Testament. The Greek on the island of Crete, you know, in the 12th century or so, predating Homer, was even more complex than Homeric Greek. So, I mean, it's an interesting topic. This is something I've done a little bit of work on. There's a whole approach to technological evolution which goes under the acronym TRIZ, T-R-I-Z. It's from the Russian. In English, it's translated Theory of Inventive Problem Solving. And what happened was you had Russian patent engineers who, during the Soviet time, had a lot of time on their hands. You know, basically they just had to show up for work. And so what they did was they looked through patents and looked for patterns of technological evolution. How did things, you know, how did artifacts, inventions arise, and how did they build on previous inventions? And actually, it was quite. There's some quite interesting results. I mean, there's several features that they discovered about technological evolution. They looked at, I think it's now well over 2 million patents that have been looked at. The key figure there was Henry Altshuler, who by himself examined 400,000 patents. And so he looked at all these patents, and there were several features in technological evolution. One is that there's a big distinction between solving routine problems and innovative problems. I mean, a lot of problems, things could be solved by just tinkering, and you make gradual improvements. And I think we see a lot of this with cars. You know, year by year, there are improvements that are made. You know, there's this microphone that's in front of us. You know, I don't know how old that is. You go back 10, 20 years before that, you're going to have more primitive microphones. So there'll be steady improvements. But the invention of a microphone itself, in the first place, was not a steady improvement on something else. I mean, it was a de novo conception, and so you have these innovative problems that get solved, and it seems that is something that happens with life also. I mean, biology seems to tinker with itself. Living organisms do solve these routine problems by means of Darwinian processes. It seems, it's Darwinism is basically a trial and error method of searching a biological space.
For example, developing resistance against some disease like that could be attributed to that.
Yeah, right. So antibiotic resistance in bacteria would be an example, and so you have these routine problems which Darwinism seems just fine for solving, but then there are these innovative problems which happen in technological evolution, seem to happen in biological evolution, and so there are other features of technological evolution. I mean, there's usually you have sudden emergence, and then you have convergence toward ideality. Now, it seems that with biological organisms, often there's not this gradual. It seems that they are usually, when they emerge, when they appear in the fossil record, for instance, they're pretty well formed and they stay the way they are. But you do then have this sort of stasis, and then you also do have competition among inventions. I mean, one thing will supersede another. I mean, you consider the old slide rule, and then the calculator comes along, and suddenly the slide rule is gone. So it's the slide rule essentially has gone extinct, and so that's a feature of technological evolution which seems to be mirrored in biological evolution. So that's an area I think of which would be of interest and would confirm could be used to confirm intelligent design.
Yeah. I asked during the lecture also about typical objections and your response to that. If you can give some of the major objections.
Major objections to intelligent design.
Yeah.
I mean, I think probably the biggest one for people is the argument from imperfect design. It's there's this I think when you look at the natural world, you see there are many things that you see. I mean, you see some exquisite design. I mean, certain flowers, certain subcellular structures. I mean, there are things that take your breath away. But then there are other things that raise questions. I mean, some things that just don't seem that well designed. The human back. People seem to have back problems. Wisdom teeth. Are these things designed? And then you have things that seem really quite marvelously designed, but have very nasty functions. You look at a rabies virus. Looks like a bullet, and it seems to be very well designed for destroying a mammalian nervous system. So what do you make of that? And I think those are real problems for people. And for me, I think the way I handle this is I come back to this notion that I don't have to show that everything is design. I just have to show some clear instances of design. And for me, the burden is not to prove the goodness of design. I mean, it's not that I come to this where my Christian God specifically arranged every instance of design in biology, and therefore, if the design is bad, then that reflects badly on this God, or if it's good, then it reflects well on this God. Designers can work through intermediates, and designs can go awry for all sorts of reasons. I mean, drugs that were meant as ways of alleviating pain can become sources of addiction. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can happen to design plans that divert them from their original course. And that's why I'm not so concerned about these bad designs. I mean, what I need to do is establish that there are some really good designs there and make my case for design as such without trying to implicate the God of my religious belief in one way or the other. And that's important because what we're doing in intelligent design is we're looking at finite arrangements of matter and whether they exhibit patterns that point us to intelligence. But from a finite arrangement of matter, what can you infer about an infinite, in my case, an infinite personal transcendent creator God? I mean, you can't get there by any sort of logical reasoning. I mean, it's the infinite is beyond the power of the finite to grasp. So you've got, so at best I could say that there's some intelligence of marvelous capacities. But one way I illustrate this is, imagine a pan balance. You've got a pound, or a kilo on one side, and it's up, and the other side is down. But you don't see what's there. There's a veil on the other side. And so how much is on this other side? Well, it's at least 1 kilo because it's pushing the other kilo up. But is it 2 kilos? Is it 10 kilos? Is it 100? Is it 1,000,000 kilos? You don't know. And so too, I think you look at the world, you see the design there in biology, you know that there's some intelligence behind it, but you don't know, you can't infer to an infinite intelligence or a creator or a transcendent being that's behind it. I mean, there's an intelligence.
Could be as Hume, he said, I think said that it could be just, you don't need an almighty or powerful, it could just be moderate intelligence.
Yeah, so that's fine.
That's good enough.
That's good enough. It could be a committee of intelligences. That was also Hume. It could, is it one or many? That's fine. But the thing is, as soon as you start getting into that territory, you're getting into theology and philosophy, and then we can pose the discussion at that level. I mean, Hume was in some ways a trickster. I mean, he was having fun, and he was being very critical of design, and is it one or many? What sort of crazy God would have done something like this? But I think then you can bring in various resources, theological and philosophical. I mean, the problem of evil is a real problem, and it's not just a problem of personal evil. There's natural evil, and how do we account for that? Mm-hmm. Once we have design in the picture, once it's established. But I think for Hume, it seems that he wanted to get rid of design, show that it was a philosophically disreputable notion entirely, and I think that can be challenged. But you raise the question, what are some of the concerns for people? I think problem of evil is one, but then you have these philosophical analyses of design. Hume offers a lot of objections in his dialogues. We could rehearse them, but I've dealt with those also in some of my writings. And then there's specific objections to the sorts of cases we've been making for intelligent design. Michael Behe's notion of irreducible complexity, mine of specified complexity, and so people are raising objections, and we're offering counter arguments, and so the discussion goes on. But I think anybody who's a dispassionate outsider looking at this discussion will see that there's a lively discussion, and it's not that one side has been just totally shut down. I mean, it's the discussion goes on. In my view, we have the better arguments. The other side thinks they've got the better arguments. And so again, I appeal to the outsider, to draw their own conclusions. Mm-hmm. And I think we're making progress. He said, I think one of the reasons we make progress is the other side. They do operate with the zero concession policy. I mean, they say we're completely wrong, and on our side, we don't have to say the other side is completely wrong. In fact, we don't. It's enough to say there's something of interest here. And most people are interested in something new. They want to say, there's something of interest here. And then once we get that admission, we've won.
There's cancellation, that's good enough.
Yeah, a draw is a win in our case.
Yeah. I was looking a little at what's called it's called gyrase, that's kind of distangling the DNA strands. Mm-hmm. Do all bacteria have a gyrase?
I don't know much about that protein, so I know that DNA can be very tightly coiled, because it tends to be, if you stretch it out, it tends to be very, very long, and so you have to pack it together very tightly. And I'm not sure if bacteria and then eukaryotes, those cells with nuclei, just what the differences are there, for storing and packing. I've seen a little bit about this, it's very precise, and
No, I was bringing up that in a discussion, mm-hmm. Debate, because I'm on some discussion forums, so actually mm-hmm. I'm debating with evolutionists about this. Uh-huh. So I thought I could, because if you can find something that is under some kind of protein that mm-hmm. is needed mm-hmm. for the reproduction of DNA and like that, mm-hmm. and they're very complex. but they need it for their reproduction. That means they cannot be a result of some evolution, because they are needed for some kind of copying, or they must be kind of before.
I know. I mean, there's a chicken and egg problem, or it's you have these things that are coordinated. And, how can you have a system that's functional without having both of these? But invariably, I find that the Darwinist tries to get around this, and by some sort of precursor that's different, and where perhaps initially these systems are not indispensable. I mean, you can have some sort of simplification, but it all tends to be very, very, very hand waving. It's, so it's. But I think there's just this sense, if you can simplify and then bootstrap up, and then and then there are various arguments by which people try to make it plausible that you could get to some tightly coordinated systems like this. And one way might be that actually you didn't get there. We look at this system, this gyrase, and perhaps we say, well, it couldn't be simplified, or you couldn't, or this system gyrase in connection with the DNA strands, couldn't be simplified. But what if there was a more complex system, and in a sense you evolved to something more complex, which was dispensable, and then eventually, you simplified down to it, and now it's indispensable. I mean, it's a Roman arch type example, I find them implausible. I don't see any concrete evidence for these sorts of evolutionary pathways, but people can tell these stories. So, I mean, I think this is where I think this work on individual enzymes. I mean, this is the point I stressed in my lecture, that I think Darwinists have hidden behind complexities, and what you need is systems that are still complex, but simple enough that we can get a really good handle on them. Right. I think this is where individual enzymes and metabolic pathways are going to be crucial. So it wouldn't be looking, in your case, you're looking at, well, the gyrase in connection with the DNA strand and how they interact, and that how could you account for this by an evolutionary path? And you can, I think the evolutionists can always imagine some system, where perhaps one, although they're now both indispensable, one part was dispensable at some earlier date in some evolutionary process. But if you can look at some very simple system where it's just, in the case of an enzyme, it's an individual structure, it has certain catalytic properties, it must have catalytic properties to have any biological function, and it can only be perturbed so much and still retain its catalytic properties, and perturbed beyond that, it loses all biological function at all. And so you have a system that then becomes inherently unevolvable. And I think that's where the next big push is coming. I think this is where, where you're going to, because you're looking at systems that are complex enough and yet simple enough, you can do a precise analysis and show that these systems are inherently unevolvable. So it becomes a very strong argument against Darwinian evolution, as opposed to just, you haven't shown us how to do it. Because the Darwinist then turns around and says, well, but it could have happened, and then they give some highly schematic outline of how it might have happened, but there are no details. I mean, you can't test it, but as long as it's a possibility, that seems to, at least for the Darwinists, trump any design explanation. We can make the case at a level where they cannot
pin them down.
Where we can pin them down. Yeah.
Just a short comment. Isn't it just apparent that the burden of proof is put on the creationists, but actually, juridically speaking, it's opposite?
Yeah.
That they are actually making the fantastic claim and should prove it.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think at some point in the future, when the dust settles, so people are just going to scratch their head that this theory was as accepted as it was. I think it's just remarkable that we talk about. I think a lot of this debate does hinge on the burden of evidence, the burden of proof, and it's often put that intelligent design is untestable. When in fact I think it's the Darwinian theory that's untestable. I mean, it would be very easy, at least we can imagine a situation in which it would be very easy for intelligent design to be refuted. I mean, you take some of these systems that we've pointed to, and you show how, by a step-by-step Darwinian pathway, you could have evolved these systems. I mean, if you can do that, I think certainly Michael Behe's main claims will have been falsified. But what would it turn it around? Behe is saying a system like the bacterial flagellum is unevolvable, appears to be unevolvable. What do they do? Do they actually show how it could be evolved? No, it's enough for them to say there could have been a series of numerous successive slight modifications of precursor systems that led up to this system. Okay, how do you deal with that? I mean, what are you going to say? I mean, you've got an virtually infinite space of possible biological pathways by which evolution from point A to point B could have happened. Okay.
But they only managed to get away with it because of the apparent burden of proof.
Well, they get away with it because the foil is design. Intelligent design, that's crazy creationism. You can't go there. So this is where, I mean, it is amazing how God and design ends up being a foil for so much of evolutionary theory. I mean, a colleague of mine named Cornelius Hunter has actually written on this. He's written a book, Darwin's God. And he shows, I think really quite convincingly, that so much of evolutionary proof and argumentation depends on using God at crucial points as a foil, as a way of, you're arguing for evolutionary theory. You come to a place where the jump to the next step seems implausible, but for it to be implausible, it's only implausible if there's a God that could have made it plausible, and so, but that's not a possibility. So it had to have happened that way.
Which is cheating.
I think it's cheating. I think it is, but
because they haven't been able to show any paths.
Not detailed
paths.
Darwinian testable pathways. I mean, there's nothing that an engineer could take and could work with. I mean, and I've pointed this out. I mean, there's because now some of the Darwinists, Behe pointed to the bacterial flagellum, this what is now known as an icon of intelligent design. Pointed to it 8 years ago now when he wrote Darwin's Black Box as a prototypical example of a designed molecular machine that was beyond the reach of Darwinian pathways and power. And what have the Darwinists come up with? Nothing in that time. I mean, they've identified one subsystem that has a function. And now, more recently, there's a fellow named Nicholas Mansky. He's actually doesn't have a PhD even, but he's very vocal intelligent design critic, and he's proposed a model in what he calls a detailed testable model with 6 steps. 6 intermediate steps getting to the bacterial flagellum. But when you look at it, what is testable about it is that some of these intermediate steps, there might be homologies with other proteins and other existing systems. So basically the intermediate steps are systems that could conceivably exist because there are other things they could borrow from that are already around. But there's no causal sequence of how you could get from one step to another. There's no account of what actual genes have to change. I mean, all of this is done in 20 pages. Bacterial flagellum has been the subject of thousands of research articles to unravel what this system does. There's still aspects of it that are not fully understood. If you were to write up an engineering manual for this system, especially if you go to the actual individual proteins, protein level, probably be looking at thousands of pages, And yet, the evolutionist thinks that in 20 pages, he or she has solved the problem of the bacterial flagellum's evolution. I think it's just ridiculous. It would convince, and I think this is part of the problem. Biologists are not trained as engineers. They don't have to get things to work. They can just imagine things to work, and there's a big difference there. For things actually to work, it's very hard to get them to work. I talk to engineers about this.
So in that case, it might be necessary for different departments of science to cooperate.
Yeah.
In order for the proof to be proper.
Yeah. Oh, I think, and I would probably go further. I think it's probably best that biologists be forced, especially evolutionary biologists, be forced to take some courses in engineering and actually learn how difficult it is to make things work. You know,
some high school science, physics, or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, courses in materials and structural engineering. I think that would be helpful. But it's So I think biology would greatly profit from a it's not just interdisciplinary. It's got to be the right disciplines. You know, I don't think sociology would be good. I think it's got to be engineering, something hard and fast. But I think it's already happening. I mean that people it's not an accident that we hear about biotechnology, bioengineering, proteomics. This has very much an engineering feel to it, but most of that work, bioinformatics, it's not getting to the origin question. I mean, it's basically already looking at existing biological systems and understanding them in engineering terms, because we cannot do better than understand them in engineering terms. But then suddenly when we try to explain their origin, we're no longer engineers. We're these fuzzy, Darwinists who are explaining things by hand-waving arguments. And what do they say? Well, that's the best we can do. History, these systems evolved so long ago, we don't have access to how they evolved, so this is the best we can do. Well, it's perhaps the best you can do when you have agreed in advance to shelve intelligent design. You're not going to look there. You've agreed in advance that you're not going to try to explain these things in engineering terms, perhaps because it's too difficult. And so this is what and you've agreed in advance that storytelling is good science.
Well, it's in one sense circular reasoning.
How do you mean that?
Well, it's like, because Darwinism has been proven, now all we need to do is to ridicule anything else.
Yeah.
And
well, that's a good point, because it's some of the, I think for many, they do think that this theory has been overwhelmingly established. I mean, you often, I don't know how many times I've seen the phrase, overwhelming evidence. It's like this overwhelming evidence for Darwinism. And I got so tired of this that I actually bought the domain name overwhelmingevidence.com. So I own it, because I also own underwhelmingevidence.com. I just want to make sure that they didn't grab either one. But because you see it so many times, and it's like, what in the world do they mean? But I think it's just I've become convinced, as my colleague Jonathan Wells has, that it's an empty slogan. It's just people throw it out because it just means that they are totally convinced that evolutionary theory is true. But I remember reading Daniel Dennett's book Darwin's Dangerous Idea when it came out in 1995, and as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, okay, when is he going to actually get to the place where he argues for the truth of Darwinian theory? He never did. He never offered any evidence for it. It was presupposed, and then it was used as a stick to beat, all naysayers, And I think so. Your point about circular reasoning, I think they've presupposed the theory, and then it's a matter of fitting all the pieces in. And intelligent design is probably now offering the strongest critique of evolutionary theory. And it's not just that I'm saying this because I'm on the inside. I've one person I correspond with occasionally is a biologist named Rupert Sheldrake, and he himself has commented. He says, you and your colleagues have raised the level of tension and anxiety on the other side higher than I've ever seen it. So it's and he was congratulating us for that. So. Yeah, I think I think the argument and the controversy will increase. I don't think we've reached the high point yet. Well, I think the fundamental issue here is whether intelligence, purpose, creativity is something fundamental to the world, or whether these are evolutionary byproducts of a blind material world. I think that's really the divide. I think you have a materialistic, atheistic conception that's very much underlying modern science, contemporary science, certainly evolutionary biology. And intelligent design is looking for signs of intelligence in biological systems, claiming to find them. And if we have in fact found signs of intelligence, then that whatever intelligence was involved there was not an evolved intelligence. It was not something that was the result of these blind, purposeless processes. And I think that is should be a source of hope and inspiration to people, because it indicates that there is a purpose and meaning to life on this planet, and hopefully for our individual human lives, and that's it seems to me that's a good thing, Now, the theory needs to stand or fall on its own, regardless of what good it might imply, but I think what I found in fact is that the evidence does support intelligent design, and that what keeps evolutionary theory propped up is not the overwhelming scientific evidence for it, but in fact a materialist presupposition, an ideology, which just drives it, because it denies the possibility of design. So you cannot even look there, and so it's a real challenge for us in the design movement to break through and get people in the scientific community to even consider this as a possibility. But I think we're making progress, and we'll keep hammering away. And I'm comforted by the fact that many ideas that start out very unpopular, as long as its proponents stay there long enough, they eventually win out. I mean, I think of this is by way of analogy, but I think of in the 1960s, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. I mean, they were the bad boys. They were they were thoroughly disreputable, and I think it was just recently that Mick Jagger was knighted by the Queen. So I think these things happen. So here we are. We're the disreputable people, but I think if we stick around long enough, we'll be the reputable people, and hopefully we'll not be as corrupt as our
Mike Jagger.
No. We'll not become as corrupt and venal as our counterparts at this point. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Jeg vil sige som sagt tak til William Dembski, og også til Lalita Das, der stod for interviewet. Du har lyttet til en udsendelse fra Radio Krishna, og har man lyst til at se mere om William Dembski, så kan man besøge ham på hans hjemmeside www.designinference.com. For produktionen af denne udsendelse stod Yadunandan Das.